That helicopter isn't broken, it just doesn't trust you. The words drifted across the scorching tarmac, low and steady, barely louder than the ticking metal of a machine that refused to come alive, and for a brief second, no one even realized who had said them. The AH-64 Apache sat crouched under the relentless afternoon sun, its matte black body absorbing heat, its rotors hanging motionless like a predator that had chosen not to hunt, while a dozen technicians in crisp coveralls circled it with tablets, diagnostic cables, and rising frustration. Every system check glowed green, every sensor reported nominal, every line of code insisted the aircraft was ready, and yet when the ignition sequence ran, there was nothing but a hollow click followed by silence that felt heavier each time it returned. Kyle Kramer wiped a streak of grease across his forearm and stepped back from the engine housing, shaking his head as if the machine had personally insulted him. His boots crunching against loose gravel. 6 hours, he muttered, louder now. Making sure the rest of the team heard it. 6 hours and this thing still won't spin. A few of the younger techs exchanged uneasy glances, their confidence thinning under the weight of failure, but Kramer wasn't done. He turned, scanning the perimeter, his eyes landing on a figure that didn't belong among the polished tools and digital screens. The old man stood just beyond the rotor arc, hands tucked into the pockets of a faded olive jacket, his posture relaxed, almost detached, as if the chaos unfolding in front of him had nothing to do with him at all. His white hair stirred slightly in the dry wind, his gaze fixed not on the technicians, but on the Apache itself, studying it the way someone studies a living thing. Kramer let out a short, incredulous laugh, the sound sharp and cutting through the thick air. Hey, he called out, gesturing toward the old man with a dismissive flick of his hand, this isn't a museum tour. A couple of technicians chuckled, grateful for the distraction. Restricted area, sir, Kramer added, the word sir stripped of any real respect. We've got this under control. The lie hung there, obvious to everyone. The old man didn't move, didn't react, his eyes remaining on the aircraft, calm, unreadable, as if he were listening to something no one else could hear. A gust of hot wind rolled across the runway, carrying with it the faint smell of fuel and sun-baked metal, and somewhere deep within the Apache's frame, a subtle tick echoed as the heat expanded its components, a small, almost imperceptible sound that made the old man's head tilt just slightly. Lieutenant Daniel Wells approached from the operations trailer, his uniform crisp, his expression tight with the strain of a situation slipping beyond his control. What's going on here? He asked. Though the answer was written in the stalled machine and the tense faces around it, Kramer gestured toward the helicopter with both hands, frustration now bleeding into his voice. Everything says it should fly, Lieutenant, everything, but it won't even start. Wells followed his gaze, his jaw tightening as the silence of the Apache pressed in around them, and then, almost as an afterthought, his eyes flicked toward the old man still standing off to the side, unnoticed by most. And who is that? Kramer shrugged, dismissive, already turning back toward the machine. No idea, he said, just some old guy watching the show. But the old man wasn't watching them, not really. He was watching the helicopter, his pale blue eyes tracing lines across its surface, lingering on seams, panels, and edges that looked perfect to everyone else. And beneath the relentless sun, with the air shimmering and the metal quietly ticking, the Apache remained still, as if waiting, not for another diagnostic, not for another command, but for something, or someone, it recognized. Lieutenant Wells took a slow breath, the heat pressing against his collar as he studied the silent aircraft, then back at the old man. Something about the stillness in those pale blue eyes unsettled him in a way he could not explain. Sir, Wells called out, stepping closer, his tone measured but firm, this is a restricted maintenance zone. I am going to need you to step back. The old man finally shifted his gaze, not startled, not defensive, just acknowledging, like someone being gently interrupted mid-thought. It has already stepped back, he said quietly, his voice rough with age yet steady, and for a moment Wells frowned, unsure what that meant. Kramer exhaled sharply, impatience boiling over. Lieutenant, we do not have time for this, he said, gesturing toward the Apache. The general is expecting a demonstration flight in less than 2 hours, and we have a $40 million aircraft sitting here like a paperweight. The word paperweight landed with a dull weight in the air, as if even saying it felt wrong. Wells nodded once, tension tightening his jaw, then turned back to the old man. If you were sent here, I need a name, he said, direct now, procedural. The old man held his gaze for a second, then answered without hesitation, Eli Vance. The name hung there. Unremarkable to most, just another name, but it seemed to settle differently in the space, like a sound that lingered longer than it should. Kramer shrugged it off immediately, already turning back toward the open panel on the side of the Apache. Never heard of him, he muttered, louder than necessary, and I have heard of everyone worth hearing about. A few of the technicians nodded in quiet agreement, clinging to their certainty. Wells glanced down at his tablet, scrolling quickly through a personnel list that returned nothing useful, no clearance record. No assignment, no explanation, just absence, and that absence felt louder than any confirmation would have. There is no record of you being scheduled here, Wells said, looking up again, but Eli Vance had already turned his attention back to the aircraft, as if the conversation had ended the moment it stopped being relevant. The Apache gave another faint metallic tick, the sound almost swallowed by the hum of distant generators. Eli's eyes narrowed slightly, focusing on a section near the engine cowling, his head tilting just enough to catch the angle of light reflecting off the surface. You ran full diagnostics? He asked, not looking at anyone in particular. Kramer let out a dry laugh. We ran everything, he replied, stepping forward, his voice carrying the edge of someone defending his expertise. Fuel system, ignition, avionics, flight controls, every subsystem is green across the board. This bird is clean. Eli nodded once, slow, thoughtful. Too clean, he said, and that made Kramer stop, just for a fraction of a second, before the irritation snapped back into place. That is not a thing, Kramer shot back, shaking his head. Systems either pass or fail, there is no in between. Eli took a few steps closer to the aircraft now, careful, deliberate, stopping just short of touching it. The heat radiating from the metal shimmered in the air between his hand and the surface. Machines that have lived, he said quietly, almost to himself. They do not behave like numbers on a screen. Wells watched him closely, something tightening in his chest, a sense that the situation had shifted without anyone announcing it. What are you saying? Wells asked, and Eli finally looked at him, meeting his eyes with that same calm depth. I am saying, he replied, you are asking it to start. He paused, letting the words settle, but you are not asking it the right way. The wind picked up again, sweeping dust across the tarmac in a thin, restless sheet, and behind them, one of the younger airmen, Lucas Reed, lowered his tablet slowly, his eyes fixed on Eli Vance. A quiet unease forming in his gut, not fear, not yet, but recognition of something he could not quite name, something that did not fit into any manual he had ever read. The wind shifted again, dragging a ribbon of dust across the tarmac as Eli Vance finally raised his hand and let it rest lightly against the Apache's side, not pressing, just touching, as if confirming something only he could feel. And the moment his fingers made contact, the noise around him seemed to dull, the distant hum of generators fading beneath a deeper, older memory that surfaced without warning. The blazing afternoon sun gave way to a thick, humid haze, the clean lines of the airfield dissolving into a dense green canopy where the air felt heavy and alive, and the steady ticking of cooling metal became the rhythmic thump of rotor blades cutting through damp jungle air, each beat slower, weaker, struggling to hold together. Eli was no longer an old man standing on hot concrete. He was young again, his hands steady despite the chaos around him, crouched beside a battered helicopter that shuddered with every rotation, its engine coughing in uneven bursts, the smell of oil and overheated metal thick in his lungs, a pilot's voice crackling through the headset with controlled urgency, not panic, never panic, but close enough to feel it pressing at the edges. And Eli's eyes moved quickly, not scanning randomly, but tracing a pattern, searching for something that did not belong, something just slightly out of place. Back on the tarmac, his fingers slid a fraction of an inch along the panel seam, stopping at a point so small it would have gone unnoticed by anyone else, a barely visible misalignment where the metal met, no more than the width of a fingernail. And he tapped it once, gently, the sound soft but distinct. Did you open this? He asked without turning. Kramer stepped forward immediately, his boots striking the ground with sharp confidence. There is no reason to open that panel, he said, his tone firm, almost defensive now. The diagnostics show no fault in that subsystem, everything behind it is reading perfectly. Eli's hand remained where it was, unmoving. Did you open it? He repeated, and this time there was something in his voice, not louder, not harsher, just heavier, like a weight placed on the question itself. Kramer hesitated, just for a heartbeat, before shaking his head. "No," he said, "because we do not go digging for problems where there are none." Eli nodded once, slow, as if that answer had confirmed more than it revealed. "That is the problem," he said quietly, and the words seemed to settle into the space between them, unsettling in their simplicity. Lieutenant Wells watched the exchange closely, his earlier certainty beginning to fracture, his eyes moving from Eli's hand to the panel, then back to Kramer. "Open it," Wells said suddenly, the decision coming faster than he expected. Kramer turned to him, disbelief flashing across his face. "Lieutenant, with respect, that seal is factory set. If we break it, we are going to be writing reports for days over." "Nothing." Wells did not look away from the panel. "Open it," he repeated, his voice steady now, leaving no room for argument. The tension tightened across the group as Kramer exhaled sharply, frustration evident in every movement as he grabbed a tool from his kit, muttering under his breath while he crouched down and began loosening the fasteners, each turn of the wrench sounding louder than it should in the heavy air. Lucas Reed stood a few feet back, his tablet forgotten at his side, his eyes locked on Eli Vance, that same uneasy feeling growing stronger, like standing on the edge of something he did not yet understand. The final fastener came loose with a small metallic click, and Kramer pulled the panel away, revealing a section of tightly packed components that looked, at first glance, exactly as the system had reported: clean, intact, perfect. Kramer glanced up, ready to prove his point, but before he could speak, Eli leaned in slightly, his gaze narrowing, and there it was, hidden in plain sight, a tiny hairline shift in a connector no diagnostic had flagged, so small it could be dismissed as nothing, unless you had seen it before, unless you remembered exactly what it meant when a machine chose silence over failure. For a moment, no one spoke. The exposed panel sat open under the harsh sun, its internal components gleaming with sterile perfection, wires neatly routed, connectors seated, everything exactly as it should be, and yet Eli Vance remained still, his eyes locked onto that single point where the connector sat just slightly off, so small it could be dismissed as a trick of the light, but his gaze did not waver, because he had seen it before, not here, not on this machine, but somewhere far from. Clean runways and controlled environments. The air shifted again in his mind, the heat of the tarmac replaced by a thick, suffocating humidity, the steady quiet replaced by the uneven pulse of a struggling engine, and he was there again, years collapsing into a single instant, crouched beside a machine that refused to respond the way it was supposed to, his hands moving with certainty while everything around him felt uncertain. The same kind of connector, the same slight misalignment, invisible to anyone relying on instruments alone, but unmistakable to someone who understood how machines behaved when they had been pushed beyond their limits. Back in the present, Eli reached into the worn pocket of his jacket and pulled out a small leather pouch, its surface cracked and darkened from decades of use, the snap worn smooth by time. Kramer watched with open skepticism, crossing his arms as he leaned slightly closer. "What is that supposed to be?" he asked, his voice carrying a trace of amusement that had not fully disappeared. "You planning to fix a modern attack helicopter with antiques?" A few of the technicians shifted, some smirking, others unsure, but Eli did not respond. He opened the pouch carefully, revealing a handful of simple tools, nothing polished, nothing digital, just metal shaped by use and familiarity, and from it he selected a small, custom ground wrench, its edges worn, its surface marked by years of work. Lieutenant Wells watched closely now, his earlier doubt replaced by something quieter, something closer to attention, as Eli leaned in toward the open panel, his movements deliberate, precise, as if he were not repairing a machine, but correcting something that had been misunderstood. "If you force it," Eli said quietly, almost as if continuing a conversation only he could hear, "it resists." His fingers found the connector, not pulling, not twisting, just adjusting, a subtle shift, less than an inch, guided by feel rather than measurement, and for a second nothing happened. The silence stretched, thick and heavy. Kramer exhaled through his nose, ready to dismiss it, but then Eli tapped the housing lightly with the side of the wrench, a soft, controlled motion, and stepped back. "Try it," he said, stepping away from the panel as if his part was already done. Kramer hesitated, his confidence now mixed with something else, something he did not want to name, but the eyes on him forced a decision. He turned, signaling to one of the technicians, "Run ignition," he said, his voice sharper than before. The technician nodded quickly, fingers moving across the control interface, initiating the startup sequence once more. The first click came, familiar, expected, but this time it did not end there. A low hum followed, faint at first, then building, the sound rolling through the frame of the aircraft like something waking up after a long silence. The rotor blades twitched, then turned, slowly, unevenly, before gaining rhythm, the air around them shifting as the machine began to breathe again. No one spoke. The technicians stood frozen, their tablets forgotten, their screens still glowing green, but now meaningless. Kramer stared at the Apache, his mouth slightly open, the certainty that had carried him all day slipping away without resistance, and beside him, Lucas Reed felt it fully now, that shift, that realization, that what he had just witnessed was not luck, not coincidence, but something else entirely, something that did not come from manuals or diagnostics, something that had been learned somewhere far beyond this runway. And as the rotor gained speed, cutting through the heavy air, Eli Vance simply closed his pouch, slipped it back into his jacket, and stepped away from the aircraft, as if it had never been broken at all. The rotor wash began to push outward in steady waves, scattering dust across the tarmac and tugging at loose fabric, the sound deepening into a full, living rhythm that filled the air with a presence that had been absent all day. And still, no one moved, no one spoke, because what had just happened did not fit into any explanation they were trained to give. Kyle Kramer stood closest to the aircraft, his eyes locked on the spinning blades, his mind replaying the sequence over and over, the diagnostics, the readings, the certainty he had held just minutes ago. And none of it aligned with what he was seeing now. His jaw tightened as if trying to force logic back into place, but it would not settle. Lieutenant Wells took a slow step forward, the wind pressing against his uniform as he watched the Apache stabilize into a smooth idle, every system now behaving exactly as it should have from the beginning, except it had not until a man with no clearance record and a pouch of worn tools had touched it. Wells turned his head slightly, looking toward Eli Vance, who was already a few steps back from the aircraft, his posture unchanged, calm, detached, as if the outcome had never been in doubt. "How did you know?" Wells asked, his voice low but clear enough to carry through the steady thrum of the engine. Eli did not answer immediately. His eyes remained on the helicopter for a moment longer, watching it not with pride, not with satisfaction, but with a quiet acknowledgement, like greeting something familiar. "It told me," he said finally, and while the words were simple, they did not sound like a metaphor, they sounded like a fact. Kramer let out a short breath that almost turned into a laugh but stopped halfway, his frustration shifting into something sharper, something closer to disbelief. "Machines do not talk," he said, shaking his head. "They output data, they follow systems, they do not." He trailed off, the argument losing strength before it could fully form. Eli glanced at him briefly, not dismissive, not challenging, just steady. "They do not talk to you," he said, and then looked back at the aircraft. The words landed harder than any direct criticism, and for a moment Kramer had no response. His confidence, built on precision and certainty, now facing something it had no category for. A few yards away, Lucas Reed felt the shift deepen, the unease now mixed with a quiet sense of realization. He had watched every step, every motion, and there had been no hesitation, no guesswork, just recognition, like someone remembering rather than discovering, and that thought stayed with him, refusing to fade. The radio on Wells's shoulder crackled suddenly, sharp against the steady hum. "Lieutenant Wells, status update." The voice on the other end was controlled, but there was urgency beneath it. Wells reached up, pressing the transmit button without taking his eyes off Eli. "Aircraft is operational," he replied, his voice steady. "Repeat, fully operational." There was a brief pause on the line, then, "Understood, Colonel Hayes is on his way." The transmission ended with a soft click, and those words settled over the group like a shift in gravity. Kramer straightened slightly, his posture instinctively correcting, the mention of the colonel snapping him back into structure, but his eyes still flicked toward Eli, searching for something, an explanation, a flaw. Anything that could bring this moment back into a framework he understood. Eli Vance, however, did not react to the name, did not adjust his stance or his expression. He simply turned away from the aircraft and began walking slowly toward the edge of the tarmac, as if his part in all of this had already concluded, as if the machine no longer required his presence. And behind him, the Apache continued to run, steady and alive, its rhythm filling the space where certainty had once stood, leaving behind a silence that no one quite knew how to break. The steady rhythm of the Apache filled the air, a deep mechanical heartbeat that pushed against the silence left behind, and as Eli Vance moved farther toward the edge of the tarmac, the distance between him and the aircraft seemed to grow faster than his slow steps could explain, as if the moment itself was already closing behind him. Kyle Kramer finally turned away from the spinning rotors, his eyes tracking Eli's retreating figure. Something unsettled tightening in his chest, not anger, not yet, but the uncomfortable realization that the control he believed he had never truly existed. "Hey," Kramer called out, louder than necessary, his voice cutting through the rotor wash, "you cannot just walk off like that." Eli did not stop immediately, his pace unchanged, the wind tugging at his jacket as he continued toward the far edge of the concrete. Lieutenant Wells stepped forward, raising a hand slightly as if to signal restraint, but the moment had already shifted. The authority that once defined the space now felt uncertain, redistributed in a way no one had formally acknowledged. The distant sound of an approaching vehicle broke through the steady hum, low at first, then building as a black command SUV rolled onto the tarmac, its tires crunching over gravel before coming to a precise stop a short distance from the aircraft. The engine cut cleanly, and for a brief second, the only sound left was the Apache itself, alive and steady. The driver's door opened, followed by the rear, and Colonel Richard Hayes stepped out with a presence that immediately altered the atmosphere, not through volume, not through force, but through a quiet authority that carried weight without effort. His uniform immaculate, his posture exact, his eyes already scanning the scene before a single word was spoken. Wells straightened instinctively, his shoulders pulling back. "Colonel," he called out, stepping forward to meet him, but Hayes did not respond right away. His gaze moved past Wells, past Kramer, past the group of technicians, and settled on the Apache, watching it for a long second as if confirming something. Then, slowly, his eyes shifted further, landing on the lone figure nearing the edge of the tarmac. Something in Hayes's expression changed, subtle but unmistakable, the kind of shift that only those paying close attention would catch, his jaw tightening just slightly, his steps redirecting without hesitation. "That him?" Hayes asked, his voice low, controlled, but carrying an edge that cut through the noise. Wells followed his gaze, then nodded once. "Yes, sir," he replied. "That is Eli Vance." The name settled into the space, and for a brief moment, nothing moved. Then Hayes began walking, not toward the aircraft, not toward the team, but directly toward Eli, his pace steady, deliberate, each step closing the distance with purpose. Behind him, Kramer watched, confusion now overtaking his frustration, the pieces refusing to fit together. "Lieutenant," he said under his breath, "what is going on?" But Wells did not answer, because he was watching too, watching the way Colonel Hayes moved, the way the situation was unfolding without explanation, and realizing that whatever this was, it was far bigger than a malfunctioning system. Eli Vance reached the edge of the tarmac and stopped, not turning immediately, as if he already knew what was coming. The wind carried the sound of approaching footsteps behind him, steady, measured, and when he finally turned, it was not with surprise, not with curiosity, but with recognition, as if this meeting had been inevitable from the moment he first touched the aircraft. Colonel Hayes came to a stop a few feet away, the rotor wash pulling at his uniform as he held Eli's gaze. And for the first time since arriving, the colonel's composure revealed something deeper, not uncertainty, not doubt, but respect, quiet and absolute. "You always did prefer to leave before anyone could say thank you," Hayes said, his voice carrying just enough to be heard over the engine, and behind him, the entire tarmac seemed to hold its breath, because in that single sentence, everything had changed. The words settled into the air with a weight that silenced even the steady confidence of the machine behind them, and for a moment, no one on the tarmac moved, because respect, real respect, did not need to be announced. It revealed itself in the smallest shifts, in the way Colonel Hayes stood, in the way his voice carried something deeper than authority. Eli Vance looked at him without surprise, his expression unchanged, as if this moment had been waiting for him long before the Apache ever failed to start. "Some things do not need thanks," Eli replied quietly, his voice steady against the low thunder of the rotors. Hayes gave a slight nod, the kind that acknowledged more than agreement, it acknowledged history. "No," he said, "but some things do," and there was a pause, brief but heavy, as if both men were standing on the edge of something only they could see. Behind them, Kyle Kramer shifted his weight, His earlier certainty now completely replaced by a growing unease. He looked from Eli to the colonel, then back again, trying to reconcile the man he had dismissed minutes ago with the reaction he was now witnessing. "Lieutenant," Kramer said under his breath, his voice tight, "who is he?" But Wells did not answer immediately, because he was watching the same thing, the same unspoken exchange, the same quiet recognition, and realizing that whatever answer existed, it was not simple. Hayes took a step closer to Eli, the rotor wash pulling at the edges of his uniform, but his posture remained steady, unshaken. "They told me you were done," Hayes said, his tone measured, controlled, but carrying something personal beneath it, "retired, off the grid, finished with all of this." Eli's gaze drifted briefly past him, toward the Apache, still running smoothly, then back again. "I was," he said, until someone asked the wrong question. Hayes allowed the faintest hint of a smile, not amusement, but recognition. "It was never about the question," he replied. "It was about who could hear the answer." Those words seemed to settle deeper than anything else that had been said, and even those who did not fully understand them felt their impact. Lucas Reed stood frozen a few yards away, his eyes wide, his mind racing to catch up with what was unfolding. The way the colonel spoke, the way Eli responded, it did not sound like a first meeting, it sounded like something long established, something earned. Kramer, however, could not let it rest, the need for clarity pushing him forward despite the tension. "Sir," he said, louder now, addressing Hayes directly, "with respect, we had a full team on that aircraft, certified specialists, top diagnostics, everything checked out, and he..." Kramer stopped himself, realizing too late how it sounded, but the question was already there, hanging between them. Hayes turned his head slowly, his eyes settling on Kramer with a calm intensity that did not need to raise its voice to command attention. "And he what?" Hayes asked, the simplicity of the question cutting sharper than any reprimand. Kramer hesitated, then forced the words out. "He fixed it like it was nothing." Hayes held his gaze for a moment longer, then glanced briefly toward the Apache, its rotors now spinning in perfect rhythm. "That is because for him," Hayes said, his voice even, "it was not something," and in that instant, the gap between knowledge and experience became impossible to ignore. Eli Vance said nothing more. He simply adjusted his jacket slightly against the wind and stepped past the colonel, not dismissive, not disrespectful, just continuing forward as if the moment had already reached its natural end, and this time, no one tried to stop him, not Kramer, not Wells, not even Hayes, because there was a quiet understanding now, shared across the tarmac, that some people did not stay to explain what they had already proven. The sound of the rotor no longer dominated the space the way it had moments ago, not because it had softened, but because something else had taken its place, something quieter, heavier, the kind of silence that settles when understanding begins to replace certainty. And as Eli Vance walked past Colonel Hayes, neither man turned to look back, because whatever needed to be acknowledged had already been said without being spoken. The wind carried the rhythm of the Apache across the tarmac, steady now, reliable, as if it had never resisted at all, and behind it stood a group of men who had spent their entire careers trusting systems, trusting procedures, now faced with something that did not follow either. Kyle Kramer remained where he was, his arms no longer crossed, his posture no longer rigid, his eyes fixed on the ground for a moment before lifting again toward the aircraft, then toward the path Eli had taken, the distance between them now feeling far greater than the few dozen feet it actually was. "Sir," Kramer said quietly. Not to Eli, but to Colonel Hayes, his voice stripped of its earlier edge. "With respect." Why him? The question was simple, but it carried everything that had shifted inside him. Hayes did not answer immediately, his gaze following Eli until the older man reached the far edge of the tarmac, where the concrete met a stretch of sun-bleached gravel and open air. Then the colonel turned slowly, his eyes moving across the team, taking in each face, each expression, before settling on Kramer. "Because," Hayes said, his voice calm, measured, "you were looking for a fault." He paused, letting the word settle, and he was looking for a memory. The distinction hung there, difficult to grasp, impossible to ignore. Lieutenant Wells exhaled quietly, the tension in his shoulders easing just slightly as the meaning began to take shape, not fully understood, but enough to feel its weight. Lucas Reed stood still, absorbing every word, every movement, the realization forming not as a conclusion, but as a shift in perspective. the kind that changes how everything else is seen afterward. Kramer shook his head faintly, not in disagreement, but in the slow process of letting go of something he had believed was absolute. But the systems, he began, then stopped himself, because the answer was already in front of him, spinning steadily in the form of a machine that had refused perfection until it was understood. Hayes stepped closer to the Apache, the rotor wash pressing against him as he looked up at the aircraft, his expression steady, almost reflective. "Systems tell you what is supposed to happen," he said, his voice carrying over the steady hum. "Experience tells you what actually does." He placed a hand briefly against the side of the aircraft, not to inspect it, but as if acknowledging it, then lowered it again, and sometimes, he added, glancing back toward the empty space where Eli had stood, "Those are not the same thing." No one responded, because there was nothing left to argue, no data point to counter what they had just witnessed, only the quiet acceptance that something beyond their understanding had just rewritten the rules they thought they knew. In the distance, Eli Vance continued walking, his figure growing smaller against the wide stretch of runway and sky, not hurried, not looking back, as if he had always been moving in that direction, long before this moment called him here. And as the Apache held its steady rhythm behind him, the men on the tarmac remained where they were, not out of uncertainty anymore, but out of respect, the kind that does not announce itself, the kind that simply remains, long after the sound of the machine fades into the open air. The Apache continued its steady rotation, the rhythm now so consistent it almost disappeared into the background, no longer demanding attention, no longer fighting to be heard, and in that quiet transformation, the entire tarmac seemed to shift with it, as if something invisible had been recalibrated. Colonel Hayes remained still for a moment longer, his eyes resting on the horizon where Eli Vance had disappeared. Then he turned back slowly, his posture unchanged, but his presence now carrying something more deliberate, something final. "Shut her down," he said calmly, and the order moved through the team without hesitation, not because it was routine, but because something about this moment required closure. The technician at the control panel responded immediately, fingers moving with renewed precision, and one by one the systems powered down, the rotor blades slowing from a confident spin to a measured rotation, then to a gradual stop, each revolution quieter than the last until the final movement settled into stillness. The silence that followed was different from before, not heavy with failure, but full, complete, like the end of something understood. Kyle Kramer stood with his hands at his sides, watching the blades come to rest, the reflection of sunlight sliding across the metal surface as it stopped, and for the first time that day, he did not feel the need to explain what he was seeing, he simply accepted it. Lieutenant Wells glanced at him briefly, then back at the aircraft, then toward the empty stretch of tarmac where Eli had walked away, and there was a subtle shift in his expression, not confusion, not doubt, but something closer to respect, the kind that forms quietly and stays. Lucas Reed took a slow breath, the air feeling different now, lighter in a way he could not quite define, and he realized that what he had witnessed was not just a repair, not just a solution, but a demonstration of something that could not be taught through manuals or simulations, something that had to be lived. Colonel Hayes stepped forward once more, stopping beside the Apache, his hand resting briefly against its side again, the metal now cool enough to touch without resistance. "You all did your jobs," he said, his voice steady, carrying across the group, "but today you saw the difference between knowing and understanding." He paused, letting the word settle, not as criticism, but as truth. "One comes from training," he continued, "the other comes from time, from experience, from listening when there is nothing left to say." No one interrupted. No one questioned, because there was nothing to add. Kramer lowered his gaze for a moment, then nodded once, a small movement, but enough. Wells straightened slightly, the weight of command now balanced with something deeper, and Reed stood still, holding on to the lesson in a way he knew would stay with him long after this day ended. The wind moved gently across the tarmac, carrying the last traces of heat and sound away, and beyond the edge of the runway, there was nothing but open space and distance, the kind that swallows footsteps without leaving a trace. Eli Vance was gone, not dramatically, not ceremoniously, just gone, as if he had never needed to be there longer than necessary, and in his absence, what remained was not confusion, not questions, but clarity. The Apache stood silent now, perfectly still, its presence unchanged, yet understood in a way it had not been before, and as the team began to move again, quieter, more deliberate, there was a shared awareness that some lessons did not come with explanations, only with moments that stayed long after they passed, and in that stillness, without announcement or acknowledgement, respect had taken its place, steady and enduring, like the rhythm of a machine that no longer needed to prove it could run.